Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Alumni Office for giving me this tremendous opportunity to speak to our wonderful alumni. It's a real privilege for me. And my name is Kamal Munir. I am a reader in strategy and policy at the Judge Business School and a fellow of Homerton College. And another hat that I wear is that of the race equality champion for the University of Cambridge. And I'm going to walk you through these slides, but before I do that, just some housekeeping notes. First of all, your microphone and camera will be turned off by the organizers and will be kept off throughout. This session will have a Q&A at the end. Please submit your questions during the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to address as many audience questions as possible, though we might not be able to answer all of them. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our Dear World Yours Cambridge YouTube channel. Okay? So without further ado, let me begin. But let me start off with a health warning. This presentation does raise awkward questions, and these are questions that we do not discuss often enough. And my position is, unless we do have these awkward conversations, it's difficult to move forward. So the other thing I should also point out is this is not an academic talk, even though it is almost entirely based on findings from peer-reviewed research. Okay? You could point to studies I have inadvertently or advertently left out, and you would be right. You could also point out it makes little sense to talk about race while leaving out class and gender. You would be right again. You could also point out rightly that rooting out racism requires a much greater systemic change, and again, you would not be wrong. And of course, there are people out there who know much more about this than I do. And I'm drawing upon what I've learned through my work as race inclusion champion at the University of Cambridge and the little that I know about organizations as a business school professor. So obviously, there's a particular context in which I'm giving this talk, right? And you're all familiar with that, why there is so much interest in this topic right now. The BLM movement started out a few months ago as a result of a death in Minnesota at the hands of police officers. So that is the particular context, but of course, there is a larger context to it too, which is inequality, right? Which of course kept rising through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and ended up in the global financial crisis. And the previous such episode was prior to the 1930s. And the global financial crisis, of course, was not just about subprime mortgages. Fundamentally, it was about growing inequality. So the moral of the story is when inequality reaches very high levels, bad things tend to happen. Now, inequality is not something that we can avoid at all times. If all of us were to do a test right now, we would get different marks and there would be some inequality of results. It is the persistence of inequality that bothers us. And that persistence is what I'm going to address specifically in terms of race. I mentioned the adverse impacts of inequality. This is from seminal work by Wilkinson and Pickett that I would very much encourage you to look up, and who measured health and social problems in all countries against how rich those countries were. And what they found out was there was very little correlation, and this was a survey only of OECD or rich countries. And there was very little correlation with how rich a country was and how few health and social problems it had. But there was a very strong correlation between the level of inequality in that country and the health and social problems. So when inequality rises, regardless of how rich a country is, health and social problems for everyone tend to go up. But it is the persistence of it that bothers me as a scholar of inequality. Because the household income gap is the same as it was when it comes to whites and blacks, at least in the United States, as it was in 1968. So is the wealth gap. This is shocking. Right? African Americans have approximately 1/10 of the wealth white Americans have, 1/10. So about $13,000 compared with about $142,000. This is in 2016 amongst non-retired households, 25 years and older. College-educated African Americans have less wealth than whites without a college education. The median has about 70% of the median wealth of non-college educated white households. So even if they go to college, it still does not bring them up to par with white households who did not go to college. Since BLM started out in America, I will start out with some data from America, but I will also come to the UK. 1 in 3 African American men born in 2001 can expect to be imprisoned at some point in his life, compared with 1 in 17 white boys. So you can note the difference. The sons of Black families in the top 1% of America's income distribution are as likely to go to prison as white sons from the bottom third. 32%, that's a third of African American children, grow up poor, a rate nearly 3 times that of white children. And only 6% of white children born between 1985 and 2000 spent part of their childhood in neighborhoods with at least a 20% poverty rate. For Black children, the figure was 66%. Enormous difference in opportunities. So this is not just about the anger that we see on the streets is not just about police atrocities or discrimination at the hands of the police or one person getting killed in an unreasonable, unjustifiable way. There's a pattern to it. And it goes on. In 1970, American cities were almost completely segregated in that 93% of Black residents would have needed to move to ensure complete integration. At the time of the most recent census in 2010, this number was 70%. So some progress, but not enough, not nearly enough. Zoning rules, which keep the cost of housing high by restricting supply, make it very hard for poor Black families to move to better neighborhoods. And when they cannot move to better neighborhoods, of course, there's a lot else that comes with that. As income inequality has risen, well-to-do families have bid up the price of homes near good schools, further concentrating poverty. Public housing programs, which could break up these patterns, again do little. And even if one has the resources, continuing discrimination makes matters worse. A recent investigation into rentals in Boston showed that in situations where a white applicant secured a viewing, 80% of the time, a Black applicant with identical financial credentials would get a viewing just 48% of the time, to the extent that often Black families would ask their white friends to ask for a viewing on their behalf. Closer to home, in the UK, Black people experienced double the unemployment levels as white people between 2004 and 2018. The UK's annual population survey reveals that Black people in employment are also paid less on average than white people. By the time the two groups reach A levels, white British students are more than 3 times as likely to achieve higher grades than Black Caribbean students, according to figures from the Department of Education. Stop and search rates between 2018 and 2019 show that Black people are now nearly 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police than white people. This has contributed to far higher arrest rates for Black people than for white people, of course. How about health problems? If you are a Black Caribbean African, you are 1.6 times more likely to be in poor health than an equivalent white person. If you're Indian, you're almost 2 times more likely to be in poorer health than a white person. If you're Pakistani, about 3 times more likely to be in poorer health. And Bangladeshi, 3.5 times more likely. How are we doing in business? Well, if you look at the Fortune 500 CEOs in America by race and ethnicity, about 96% of them are non-Hispanic white. And Blacks are only, who are about 14% of the American population, represent only 0.8% of CEOs. And it is not just CEOs. In US finance companies, only 2.4% of executive committee members, 1.4% of managing directors, and 1.4% of senior portfolio managers are Black. Remember, they're 14% of their population. A mere 1.9% of tech executives, which claims to be flat, not hierarchical, and much more democratic, and with it, only 1.49% of tech executives and 5.3% of tech professionals are African American. The average Black partnership rate at US law firms between 2005 and 2016 was 1.8%. All this, of course, has a cascading impact on economic and social well-being. UK business figures. So the 2020 Parker Review is probably the best guide to what is going on, which was published earlier this year. And it found that almost 60% of the 256 firms it reviewed did not meet the Parker Review target, which was only to have one director of an ethnically diverse background on their board. 256 firms that it reviewed. Only 5% of FTSE 250 firms had a person of color as director, only 5%. And only 2% of FTSE 250 firms set measurable objectives for board ethnic diversity. Why does this persist? Because there's a tremendous lag. And we just haven't done enough to close this gap. Racism has essentially become, or discrimination based on race has become institutionalized in our organizations. Not just in our organizations, even in the technologies that we use, the products that we use, the services that we consume, it has become entrenched, it has become institutionalized in all that. Here's an example. Here's an industry that I've done some research on. For many decades, color film in the US was calibrated to highlight Caucasian skin tones. So basically, when you were making film in a lab, there was a trade-off. So you could make film that would capture Caucasian skin tones better, or you could make film that would capture Black skin tones better. Obviously, it was decided that we will make film which will highlight Caucasian skin tones better. So that is how film was calibrated against Caucasian skin. So, and this is what happens in all technologies, right? It has to be calibrated against particular people, particular behavior, and people are disadvantaged as a result of product design. In fact, when the famous new wave filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard was commissioned to make a film about Mozambique, he reportedly refused to use Kodachrome film, the most advanced color film at the time. He complained the film, which was developed for a predominantly white market, was racist. But it is not just film, it is not just products that we consume that are racist, our organizations are racist as well. And that is what I'm going to talk about. So let's come to organizations and what happens within organizations. Here's a study published in 2001. Wherever I have cited studies, I have made sure they are very good, from very good journals, top journals in most cases, and are peer reviewed and meet the highest standards of research, because otherwise we could talk about anecdotal evidence and that wouldn't really get us anywhere. So this is all research based. There's a somatic norm of whiteness by default, which elevates whiteness to a gold standard and implies that non-white races do not belong. And this was a study of the British Senior Civil Service, where whiteness was a somatic norm. And it was basically, British civil servants who were middle-aged, middle-class white men, an image that was interlinked with the concept of a rational and neutral civil servant. So anyone who deviated from that somatic norm, looked a bit strange. So just think of, what comes to your mind when you think of a Cambridge professor, for example. So that is what I mean by somatic norms. In a quick button pressing study of implicit biases, 58% of online test takers were slower to associate positive language with black faces than with white ones. So it becomes cognitively ingrained in us. It becomes an implicit bias. Only 14% displayed the opposite tendency. There's another study by Dana Maestro who looked at hundreds of news reports in 3 big American papers about professional athletes accused of crimes. And the articles, of course, were anonymized, and so you didn't know that, whether it was an article about or white or black, but it was found that articles were more accusatory of the alleged perpetrators when the perpetrators were black. They were more likely to provide context and humanizing detail when the accused were white. Again, a similar study at the University of Michigan used machine learning to predict an athlete's race based on words that appeared in an article containing their name. Purely relying on the language of news reports, the model was able to predict that Ronda Rousey, a wrestler, was white with a 96% certainty, whereas there was only a 3% probability that Eric Berry, an NFL player, was white. So it went with other athletes. So language is important. How we represent different races, different people in media, in our textbooks, in all discourse is hugely important, and conveys all kinds of implicit biases and perpetuate those biases, right? And stereotypes, as you know, have consequences. I mean, the image on the left is, of course, from a protest against Starbucks, where 3 black young men who were waiting for a friend in Starbucks were arrested when somebody called the police. 3 white men waiting in a Starbucks, would not have been arrested. Okay? So these stereotypes, I told you about stop and search, and so these stereotypes certainly have consequences. Here's another study, right? An audit study, which basically consisted of people writing to hotels in various cities of America and asking the hotel, telling them that they were coming to that city for a few days, and if the hotel could please tell them what were some of the restaurants that they could patronize when they were in the city. Just judging from the names of the emailers, the responses were significantly different. So if it was an obviously white name, there was a certain list of restaurants that was supplied. The tone of the email was different. If it was an obviously black, so often in a significant number of times, even the restaurants that were proposed or recommended were different, and a higher number of times the emails did not even get a response. In other studies, Dreher, for example, found external labor market systematically pays a premium to white males. Another study of 98 executives from Standard & Poor's 500 over the course of 17 years, Mithani and Mooney, recent top journal paper, shows that even white executives with names that sound African-American were paid 55% less than executives with white-sounding names, with the gap increasing with hierarchical positions. Of course, we know that with non-Christian names, for example, there is a systematic bias, and that is what leads to resume whitening and people essentially whitening their names and christening their names, and in order to avoid this discrimination. But even white executives with names that sound African Americans can pay the penalty. Westphal and Stern show how the same performance and behavior by firm directors results in lower rewards if the individual belongs to racial minorities. They also find that this phenomenon is less prominent if the organization has previously hired an executive with a black sounding name, which they note suggests that exposure decreases bias. This is important, that exposure does tend to decrease bias. And this is a theme that will crop up later as well. Now, here's another paper. This was published in American Journal of Sociology, which is a top research journal in sociology. And what it finds is that prospective employers preferred white candidates who had a criminal record over clean black candidates without a criminal record. So not only was there discrimination against black candidates, but even when black candidates were competing with whites with criminal records, the discrimination, of course, it reduces, but persists. Shocking results. Another study of black and white female corporate executives, Bell and Nkomo find that white women are systematically seen as more competent and diligent than black women for the same work. Another study which is interested in the determinants of white male leadership, Heckman, Johnson, Fu and Yang conducted field and laboratory tests of ethnic minority or female leaders who engaged in diversity valuing behavior and found they were penalized with worse performance ratings, whereas white or male leaders that engaged in diversity valuing behavior were not penalized. This, of course, has direct relevance to me because for my work as a race equality champion at the university, because what this research shows very clearly is that if a white person is doing the same job, they will not be penalized. In fact, they will be rewarded for the same job. But if a minority who is doing diversity valuing a job and bringing these issues to light, they are penalized for that. Biases have also been linked to consequences for resource allocation in organizations. So Lount et al. Found that biased observers tend to negatively evaluate and treat racially diverse teams, resulting in decreased resource support for such teams, for racially diverse teams. So, back to the previous point that I made, so it is far more likely for a white person doing my job, for example, to be able to be allocated more resources than a non-white person. This is also fascinating, right? White male top managers react to the appointment of a female or racial minority CEOs with a diminished sense of organizational identification, which in turn leads to a lower level of support for minority status colleagues. So what it means is that when a minority candidate is appointed to a top position as a CEO, then the white candidates essentially check out and they reduce their support for the CEO. In fact, they take it as an affront that they were overlooked for this position and a minority person was appointed CEO. This is from well-known organizations around us. And this is behavior that these are not one-offs. This is all systematic research that has gone through hugely important peer-reviewed process, a rigorous peer-reviewed process. Black managers report receiving less psychosocial support than their white counterparts do. Black employees are less likely than whites or Hispanics to say that their company's mission or purpose makes them feel their job is important. So they get less support, less encouragement, and less resources. And Black leaders are more likely than white ones to leave their organizations. This is, I've mentioned the journal name again because I'm an editor of this journal. Wooten was dean at Cornell, is now president of another university in the US. And Erica James, of course, has just been appointed the dean of Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. And in their study, which they published in this journal that I edit, they found that Black leaders who do rise to the top are disproportionately handed glass cliff assignments, which offer nice rewards, but carry a greater risk of failure. So they are appointed often when the organization is in difficulty and the job is far more difficult. There are also various studies which show that Black or BAME people often move in their own networks. 3/4 of whites have no Black people in their social circle. Discriminators are willing to forego 8% of earnings in order to avoid working with someone of a different ethnicity. Shocking findings from the world of organizations. This is interesting. This is Lauren Rivera, who I think did her work at Princeton, or at least was published by Princeton. She's probably at Northwestern University now. She investigated the hiring process at elite law firms, investment banks, and management consulting firms. And she found that candidates with similar experiences, personal interests, and presentation styles to interviewers were preferred and championed, sometimes at the expense of hard skills. So hiring was basically a cultural matching process rather than a simple skill evaluation. So all this speaks to why inequality is perpetuated. And what we are focusing on particularly here is, of course, racial inequality. So hiring is essentially cultural matching, where we are looking for similar attributes, as us in the candidates who we are interviewing. And this, of course, is found everywhere in organizations. And here's a case in point. If you look closely, the top picture is a picture of the Obama White House interns. And the bottom picture is the Trump White House interns. You can see Obama standing right in the middle of the picture and Donald Trump standing right in the middle of the picture, at the bottom. Can you notice any difference between the two pictures? Who was hired as interns? Can you notice which group is more heterogeneous? I don't think we need to say anything more about these pictures. Here's the top journal in economics, a study from the top journal in economics, American Economic Review, which shows how a community college instructor basically can make a difference in the performance of the children in the classroom. So when you have people from the similar background as the children in the classroom, their performance tends to increase. So I'm reading from the abstract where they say, we find that performance gap in terms of class dropout rates and grade performance between white and underrepresented minorities, performance gap basically between whites and minorities closes by 20 to 50% when taught by an underrepresented minority instructors. Across Cambridge colleges, what we are hearing from minority students is that they would like more pastoral care from minority tutors who belong to minorities and are people of color. I could go on. There is a plethora of research on this stuff, how organizations perpetuate racial inequality day in and day out while claiming to be hugely meritocratic. So what do we do? Well, it's a good time to act, right? If something is to be done, there is some momentum behind us. The share of Americans who see racial discrimination in their country as a big problem has actually risen from 51% in January 2015 to 76% now. Okay? So a lot more people think that racial discrimination is a problem now. 52% of Britons think British society is fairly or very racist, a big rise from similar polls in the past. Businesses also seem to be waking up to this problem, so let's strike while the iron is hot. Racial diversity seems to be good for business too, in fact, more so than gender diversity, according to this McKinsey study, who basically find out how likelihood of companies in top diversity quartile outperform their industry for profitability compared with bottom quartiles. What we should not do, of course, is things that might be considered fig leaves, right? I mean, so Goldman Sachs, for example, received a flurry of media attention after announcing at Davos that it will carry out IPOs only for companies that have at least one woman or non-white board member. As CEO David Solomon put it, starting on July 1st in the US and Europe, we are not going to take a company public unless there is at least one diverse board candidate with a focus on women. while the attention to this issue should be lauded, it should not stop accountability. Because what we don't want is one privileged woman serving on multiple boards and without addressing the fundamental underlying process, because oil and gas firms have been doing it for years. Share of women on their boards has doubled over the past 10 years, now about 14%, still only about 14% now. But if you look at the talent pipeline and culture, little seems to have changed. What doesn't work? Staying silent does not work. Business as usual does not work. Strategic color blindness that, okay, we are meritocratic, we overlook color, does not work if the agenda is to close the gap. And that should be the agenda, closing the gap, because the gap, the inequality that persists is bad for everyone. Defensiveness is not good. It doesn't work. Okay? So we should wholeheartedly engage in these conversations. And there were a lot of conversations after George Floyd's death where a number of people basically sort of tried to argue that he deserved it somehow. He had a criminal record, so and on and so forth. So that kind of defensiveness, which sometimes goes by the name of white fragility, doesn't help. Most law firms, the fact that most Wall Street firms require new hires to sign arbitration contracts, agreeing to not to join class actions, making accountability more difficult, does not help. Diversity training, right? I mean, that's a favorite go-to for organizations. Well, in about 1,000 studies, it comes out that while people soon forget the right answers on bias trainings, white people soon forget the right answers on bias training. The positive effects of diversity training rarely last beyond a day or two, and a number of studies suggest it can activate bias or spark a backlash even. In their study, Dobbin, this is Dobbin et al., Dobbin is at Harvard, also find that diversity training has no or negative consequences for minorities and women to achieve managerial positions. So it does not seem to affect how you get promoted in the organizations. In their multi-method study that included an audit study, lab experiment, and interviews, Kang et al. Find that minority applicants whitened their resumes less when applying to firms that claim to value diversity. However, organizational diversity statements were not associated with reduced discrimination, their research found. And 5 years, studying these same companies 5 years after they instituted training for managers, companies saw no improvement in the proportion of white women, Black men, and Hispanics in management, and the share of Black women actually decreased by 9%. Cultural matching, I've already talked about. I'll talk about grievance procedures, where lab studies have showed that protective measures like grievance systems lead people to drop their guard and let bias affect their decisions. Because in such cases, the onus is almost entirely on the victim. So if, and tragically, you cannot play the race card more than once maximum. Most people are reluctant to play it even once because they still have to survive within the dominant majority. And if you have resorted to complaining about racial discrimination, then you can be and become an outcast and be branded and left out of networks of conversations and so on. So grievance procedures which put the onus on the victim. If I were to complain, for example, of racial discrimination, the onus is entirely on me to supply proof that that person has never treated any white person, like they have treated me. You can imagine how difficult it is for people of color to come up with all that evidence. Once people see that a grievance system isn't warding off bad behavior in their organization, they can become less likely to speak up. So they just reconcile with how things are. And of course, managers who receive few complaints conclude that their firms don't have a problem. What we also must be vigilant about is not let our clients keep us from eliminating discrimination. So, you know, I mean, when you look at professional services firms, you look at hospitals. So if you go to a hospital, for example, you work at a hospital, sometimes your patients can pressure you that I want to be seen by a white person. Would you expect the hospital to yield to such requests? If you don't want the hospital to, then you should also follow that lead. Okay? So when your clients basically drop subtle hints that they would rather deal with a white partner than, you know, a person of color, then you should not yield to such requests, whether they are direct or indirect, whether they are blunt or subtle, because that is exactly the argument that was used in the Jim Crow South, where shopkeepers said that sales would suffer if Black customers and residents were allowed in, okay? Because that would turn rich white customers away. What do? Engage managers, allocate resources to this education, this training, and it should not be one short workshop. There should be awkward discussions on this subject. And so far, very few companies have actually had these awkward discussions in there. You know, invite people from outside to start to kick off these awkward discussions, because people do begin to change their views once we engage them. Make them champions of diversity. Focus on actively expanding your recruitment to minorities. It works. Mentoring definitely works. All studies show mentoring works. So get your minority employees mentored, and it also turns mentors into champions, right? Reward them on the basis of how well their mentees do. So this is an awkward conversation, of course, but we should not shy away from that, and also not rest when you know, sometimes you hear, okay, we've got a woman, so we are pretty diverse, and you know, we don't need to do anything further. And also, defensiveness doesn't work. This is an E&Y study of 1,000 US workers. 1/3 of the respondents said the corporate focus on diversity had overlooked white men. Contact with minorities works. So, and there was, you know, the first evidence that came to light was from World War II, where it was found, because in World War II, the US suffered more casualties than it was expecting. At that time, Blacks were not invited for, or not recruited for active combat duties. And then they were enlisted for active combat, and they found that battalions where whites and Blacks were fighting for the same goal together as equals saw a lot less racism. So integration and exposure works. There's another study at UC Berkeley who found that integration during school years has enormous effect on adult life. For Black youth, integrated schooling increases wages by 30% and reduces the chance of incarceration by 22 percentage points. So, and you know, as another scholar of inequality in education concluded, Francis Pearman at Stanford concluded, there's nothing magic about sitting next to white children, but one thing that's consistent in the history of American schooling is that resources follow white children. So if Black children find themselves next to white children, they will also benefit. Transparency. Have as much transparency as possible. So grading, for example, if you find evidence of discrimination in grading, ask graders to justify their grades. As soon as there is more social accountability, when they have to publicly justify their grades, that the discrimination studies have found tends to drop. So again, you know, here's another study from Emilio Castiglia of MIT, who suggested transparency to activate social responsibility. And so once firms start posting each unit's average performance rating and pay raise by race and gender, once managers realize that employees, peers, and superiors would know which parts of the company favors whites, the gaps in raises all but disappeared. So make things as transparent as possible with a focus on color and race and diversity. Diversity task forces seem to help. create a diversity task force and give them a mandate to promote social accountability, to promote more diversity, to encourage more mentoring, and to make sure that they are given clear metrics. CEOs usually assemble these teams, inviting department heads to volunteer and so on. And these diversity numbers should be looked at for the whole company, for business units and for departments to figure out what needs attention. So I will stop here. We have about 20 minutes now, and I will take questions now. So let's see if we have any questions. So what we are saying is, so the first question, John White, are you not relying on an awful lot of US research? Yes, I am relying on US research, although I have also cited a lot of UK research. The question just disappeared for some reason, but I have also sort of cited a lot of UK research. The patterns that the things that perpetuate inequality in organizations are no different. The mechanisms that perpetuate inequality are very similar. And I also told you how many of FTSE 250 firms, for example, have people of color as directors and so on, and how sort of upstream Black people or BAME people tend to do both in terms of education, social problems, and health problems. Now, let me see. I've also already answered. Okay, so Sukhwant is saying from those two pictures, Obama and Trump, does it not show that Obama discriminated against whites? I don't know. I didn't count the number of people, but as interns, if you want to give a leg up to people, certainly you should not go overboard. Although if the agenda is closing the gap, then that is how we justify quotas, and that is how we justify giving people more opportunities to excel, people who have been denied these opportunities and people who would otherwise not have gotten these opportunities. So yes, it's contextual, it's situational, and certainly the point is not to discriminate against whites, but to be able to understand what is it that systematically keeps BAME people or Black people behind. Over generations, I told you, the wealth gap, sort of is same as it was in 1968. Is there also the issue of, so Joanna is saying, is there also an issue of hiring BAME as ticking the box exercise in relation to hiring people with similar culture queries? I'm not sure what you mean exactly, Joanna, but it should not be ticking the box, certainly, because what we also want is diversity of thought. So we don't want, sort of, again, cultural matching could even extend to a person who is, who's a person of color, but has exactly, masquerades, sort of, or pretends to have exactly the same views as somebody else. We need to create more room for diversity of thought. So that is the point, and diversity of backgrounds and diversity of perspectives in all this, and for difference. Interesting question from Amkela Nwenya, who is saying, other than doing research and exposing the devastating effects of inequality on society, what else are business school academics doing to help business organizations address issues of inequality? Well, we are highlighting it. We are certainly highlighting it. And since this movement has started, since a number of us have started speaking about it, and I still maintain that not enough people are in or outside business schools are speaking about it. But when we are speaking about it, some business organizations have reached out. right? Some have reached out to me, others may have reached out to other people who have asked me to trigger these conversations with their top management teams. And I tell you, these are awkward conversations for people who are listening in. And I get a lot of questions, defensiveness, and so on and so forth, but that's okay. You know, we start somewhere. Even if we have made 10% difference, 20% difference, that is still a difference. And what we also need to do, of course, is we also need to look at our own curriculum. We have, you know, when in business school papers, peer-reviewed research, whiteness is not a color, right? And somebody is only identified by color when they are not white, right? White people are the default. Right? And we need to bring this out. And when somebody else, if a person of color is talked about, we talk about as if they have access to exactly the same resources in the organization. So the actual context of being a non-white person or a female in the organization, female more so, we have made more progress on the gender front thanks to, you know, sort of decades of struggle by women to raise awareness of this systematic discrimination, but certainly not on the race front. And we need to bring the actual context out in our textbooks, in our case studies, in our research papers. Francis is saying, what is your take on positive action? My own experience in various organizations is that only when a deliberate policy of seeking out, promoting, and appointing talented BAME people does diversity start to mean business. That takes white champions to take up the cause, even if only to get the process started. I agree with you, Francis. I think it's been my experience too. And I was talking to a very large firms that were a firm, one of the largest firms in the world that was under fire for not having enough diversity. And they told me that, you know, at some point they did an audit, and they found out that in the top management, there was hardly any representation from people of color. And what they did was they did exactly what Francis is suggesting. They took some BAME people and they just promoted them. That's it, just like that. Some of them, a small minority of them, he said, were not ready for the job. Okay? But for most, they just, you know, took like ducks to water. So yes, I mean, even if there is a small minority who might not be ready for the job, you need people at the top to act as mentors, to act as role models, and to get the process started. So it needs to start somewhere. Daniel is saying, should we first tackle the them versus us mentality in promoting less realistic societies? Racialistic societies, I'm sorry. I also wonder if racial neutrality is more productive a notion than equality or equity for us to move forward. Well, Daniel, I mean, this is the point that I raised early on in the talk, that racial neutrality can basically mean that we are agnostic to color, we are blind to color, and that is not the way to bring up, you know, to ring in equality or equity, because there are people who find access to resources more difficult. There are people who do not have access to the same networks, the same mentoring, and we need to recognize those things. We cannot be neutral on those things. We need to actively help those people and bring them to the same level of opportunity. Anonymous question, the upcoming generation is more aware of including people from all backgrounds, colors, and ethnicities. How can we change the view of the older generation who have a tunnel vision of race, both in the workplace and in their personal lives? I don't know about that. I certainly didn't cite any study which, you know, sort of connected racism with age. you could presumably make an argument that the longer you have been socialized in a particular milieu, the longer it will appear as normal to you, and the more stark a deviation from that will appear to you. But I showed you that similar patterns of discrimination exist even in tech firms, which tend to be a lot younger. So it seems to cut across age boundaries. Pascal Wenz is asking, could you elaborate on the difference between short-term diversity training that does not seem to work and the more serious engagement and awkward conversations that you propose? Certainly, Pascal. So the short-term diversity training is essentially exercises that are decoupled from the functioning of the organization. Okay? And we have such exercises. We bring in consultants to run diversity trainings. Most research shows that in a few days, these things are forgotten. The right answers are forgotten, and people go on with that. In fact, it leaves people with an impression that the firm is an equal place. And what we instead need is we need to create mentoring programs. We need to actively recognize that there are people in our organizations that are discriminated against, directly or indirectly, advertently or inadvertently, and we need to have diversity task forces. We need to have such metrics. And in the process of all that, you will inevitably have awkward conversations. You will have resistance, but that will actually tell you more about your organization and where it stands. Okay, so here's a question by masterclass@isaacphysics.org. I am working on a project to increase diversity in higher education undergraduate degree courses by supporting A-level students academically and through mentoring. Do you think that mentoring would be most effectively provided by target group BAME mentors? Is it reasonable to overtly offer this? This is an interesting question because often we do resort to mentoring, whether it's mentoring or reverse mentoring. So at Cambridge University, we have a scheme for reverse mentoring, where some of us have been asked to reverse mentor members of top management team at Cambridge University. And I should highlight, for full disclosure, that we are as guilty as any other organization in terms of lack of diversity in the top administration of the university. And we are working on that. But in order to expect BAME people to do all the heavy lifting and not even compensate them. So when I do this work, for example, I essentially do it because I think this is important work. It is not, compensated in terms of, what it actually takes, the number of hours, the effort that it takes. And so we don't want to, and the students, my African and Caribbean students complain of exactly the same thing, that when we want to run programs, we go to our BAME students, African students, and we ask them to run these schemes. And whereas others can just go on and do their work, my colleagues can just go on and do their research and not have to do this extra work. I don't think that is fair. So I think this is a fair point that you are raising. And so if we are putting more pressure, if we are work pressure and workload on BAME people, then they should be compensated and they should be recognized for that. How do we, Tatiana Sokolov is saying, how do we change hearts and minds and cultivate the desire to bring about change? I think it begins from acknowledging that there is a problem. So unless we acknowledge that there is a problem and we try to bring everyone on the same page and we convince people that there is a problem in our organizations, we cannot start this process. And then I've already mentioned some of the processes. I won't repeat them here in order to bring about these changes. And exposure matters, integration matters. Once there is more integration, once there is more exposure, once there is more working together, people tend to look beyond color then. And they basically begin to recognize that this person has other talents as well. I have been reading the questions out from the beginning. So I'm going to jump towards the end and take some questions right from the end. Then somebody is asking, what would your advice be for parents of mixed race children in the UK? Based on research, are these children counted as black or as white in these studies? I'm afraid I don't know the answer to this question. If you email me, I might be able to dig up some studies for you, but you know, sort of. Carla Groom is asking, what evidence have you seen about the effects of BAME interviewers or interview panels? I also fear the burden on BAME colleagues who are constantly interviewing. You're absolutely right, Carla. There is a burden. There is an inordinate burden, and that should be looked into. As far as evidence is concerned, like I said, a lot of interviewing tends to be cultural matching. We talk in cultural reference that advantage particular communities over others. And again, if you email me, I can send you some studies on that interviewing. Saroj Datta is asking, what proportion of people in an organization need to be persons of color for there to be a positive effect on race discrimination? Well, we need to go, a long way in that. I mean, generally, what research shows is at least 30% in order to make a difference. But, I mean, let's not go into numbers, but let's try to change attitudes. And I don't think we need to hit a particular number. We need to do audits. We need to constantly have our finger on the pulse of how the lived experience is of your employees of color in the organization. And are you moving in the right direction or not? Anonymous attendee, can you comment on lack of racial diversity in academia, particularly at senior levels? Well, take a look at all the vice chancellors in UK universities and tell me how many of them are non-white. Take a look at our top management team in universities and tell me, take a look at all the heads of houses, the college masters at Cambridge, and tell me how many of them are non-white, and you will get your answer to that. Questions, I'm looking for questions. Okay, so I think we are out of time now. So I would just like to thank you for joining us. And like I said, if you have any questions, send it to me via email. I don't promise to answer all emails because, there's just emails that are out of control. But thank you very much for bearing with me. And hopefully this has been of some use to you. Thank you.